very warm welcome to everyone for coming and joining us for the Caribbean Studies Network seminar today. This is the second of our seminars this term. I'm just going to start by introducing our speakers, and then we'll get on with it. So we're extremely honoured to welcome Kaiama Glover, who's the Anne Whitney Olin Professor of French and Africana Studies at Barnard College, Columbia University, where she's also the director of the Digital Humanities Centre. Professor Glover is the author of two books, Haiti Unbound, which was published as a spiralist challenge to the post-colonial canon, which was published by Liverpool University Press in 2010. And I saw this morning is actually available open access, which I know is very important at the moment. And her most recent book, A Regarded Self, Caribbean Womanhood and the Ethics of Disorderly Being, which came out just last month with Duke, and that's the book we're going to be talking about today. That's very much the tip of a large iceberg of scholarship and of writing. Kaiama is the editor of special issues of Small Axe and Yale French Studies, most recently the Haiti Reader in the Duke University Press Readers Series, and that's something I'd very much kind of draw your attention to. That's an incredibly useful resource, just a wonderful book to have. And she's also an acclaimed translator, bringing many of Haiti's great 20th century literary works into English, including Franck Etienne's Ready to Burst, Marie Chauvet's Dance on the Volcano, and René Depestre's Hadriana in All My Dreams, which is a very prominent presence in A Regarded Self. So we're extremely pleased to welcome Kaiama. Kaiama is going to be in conversation today after her presentation with Hazel Thompson, who, again, we're absolutely delighted she could join us. Hazel is an MST student in the World Literatures program here in Oxford. She's a specialist in Caribbean literature on writers like Jamaica Kincaid and Eric Roach, and she joined us earlier this year from University College London. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Kaiama to talk to us a little bit about her book.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. Obviously, I want to say thanks to you, Will, Ghosh, and to the whole of the Caribbean Studies Network at Oxford for inviting me into this community of thinkers and readers today. And also, of course, to Hazel Thompson for being up for engaging closely with the work. You know, I'd say more so than previously in my professional life, it's felt like a luxury to stay present to books and to literary fiction like this, just insofar as I'd say these pandemic and politically terrifying times seem to call on us to pay close attention to the real material challenges and outright disasters of our everyday life. And so I extend my sincere thanks to you all as well for spending this time with me immersed in work and in ways of thinking that matter perhaps differently, put it that way. So A Regarded Self is certainly, I won't talk for too long because I'm very curious to sort of engage, desperate perhaps to engage with people live and in person about the work in the absence of physical presence with colleagues and friends. But the book is certainly a declaration and an embrace of my own identity as a lover of literary fiction and a believer in literary fiction's capacity to reveal truths to us in ways that defy the constraints of historical narrative, particularly those truths that have been absented from or silenced within the so-called archive, or the archive, capital T, capital A, as well as truths that pertain explicitly to our present moment. And this book, in fact, emerges from my thinking about the extent to which the material realities of our contemporary world, our contemporary 21st century moment, the history that we're experiencing, the history that we're making right now, how grappling with these realities can make it difficult, in fact, to center the literary, even for those of us whose job it is to do so. Because if we're working on race and gender in the academy, there's a de facto political engagement to our work, right? And given this, I've wanted to be attentive of late in particular to how the politics we rely on for our survival, especially for those of us who are unfavorably raced, gendered, or otherwise othered, how the politics we rely on for our survival have the potential to harden into constraints when it comes to how and what we read and teach. As a Caribbeanist scholar, I've long been invested in reading and teaching works that articulate these survival strategies, or I should say, works that have been read, that I and others have read for a politics, for confirmation of values and ways of being that counter the values and ways of being that are inherent in the dominant North Atlantic model of the human. And this perspective has largely been a comfortable one for me, right? Caribbean literature as counter discourse and counterpoint to the white Western canon. But regarded self sort of began percolating in moments of tension or discomfort that I felt with that very premise. More specifically, I found myself thinking about works of Caribbean fiction that I felt had been more or less subtly mishandled, I guess I would say, within the canon of the marginal, right? And the canon of the marginal being something that I'd already been preoccupied by in my first monograph on the spiralists and thinking about these Haitian authors' relegations to the eccentric margins of a periphery, the periphery that is literature of the French-speaking America. So I've long been sort of interested in the question of centers and margins as they displace inward, even within those who've been made marginal to more dominant centers. But we can talk more about that later. So anyway, this is where the book originated, in a desire to sort of leave to the side the enemies we know, so bigotry in its most reprehensible and overt forms, in order to think about the boundaries and the borders that we professional readers may have created within our own canon. And in A Regarded Self, I pay a particular attention to texts that have engendered almost what I've seen as sanctioning critical responses because of their arguably politically incorrect representations of Caribbean community, texts that sit at the intersection of Blackness, womanhood, and community desire, or desire for the community and desire of a given community. So that's the ostensible premise of the book. In a talk that I gave last month, I was asked to state the main takeaways of my book and to be brief, in just sort of like the elevator pitch or what have you of the main points of the book. And I came up with two things. One, community is not for everyone. And two, narcissism is underrated, at least when it comes to women, and particularly when it comes to Black women. Actually, one of the shadow titles of the book was Disorderly Women, Narcissism as Ethic in Caribbean Fiction. But I got quite a lot of pushback to that title, and I didn't want the title to be an obstacle to the book. So while I discuss narcissism, and really while narcissism is something that is at the very origins of my thinking about Caribbean womanhood, there was a way in which the very fact of stating it outright, I had to recognize as being something that might even be too off-putting for a reader to appreciate some of the things or some of the subtleties I was trying to get to in analyzing these texts. So I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about narcissism today, but just to say it is this sort of shadow presence or shadow concept that undergirds my understanding of self-regard. Because what I'm arguing throughout the book is that there's very much an established literary tradition in the Caribbean, one that is dominated by the not inaccurate contention that community in the Caribbean offers a counter of sorts to the exploitative and predatory forms of individualism that are the bedrock of North Atlantic empire. I'm not going to argue with that perspective, but what I do look to unpack in A Regarded Self is the way in which this premise risks eliding the experiences of those for whom ostensibly righteous and ostensibly liberatory Caribbean communities can in fact be coercive. Specifically then, A Regarded Self is about works of Caribbean fiction that pay attention to the costs for women of privileging the self, despite the availability of seemingly righteous or liberatory community. And so the book considers women who aspire to an exclusive relationship with the self. And it asks that we think about how aspiring to adamant self-regard might in fact be viewed as an ethical practice. I wanted to think about what it looks like in particular works of Caribbean literary fiction to defend the self against the coercions of communal belonging, what it looks like to embrace what Jack Halberstam might call the wild, thinking of his recent book, Wild Things, or what Saidiya Hartman might call waywardness, right? Her recent work, Wayward Lives. So ways of sort of refusing integration or co-optation. And I'll just say also that very important to me, what made this query interesting to me was thinking about this relationship between the self-regarding Caribbean woman and her community, both textually, right? So as in looking at how particular Caribbean women characters are configured with respect to their narrative communities, but then also extra-textually, as in how do these characters, or how do these texts disorder or disrupt our critical desires and expectations as professional readers of literature? How do we even value expressions of individual freedom that don't amount to anti-racist, feminist, or otherwise recognizably political projects? And so what I've been hoping is that the book will open up to conversations about how we think of women's self-centeredness in the most literal sense, when that kind of self-focus doesn't attend to or attach to a polis-facing agenda or practice. What is individual freedom worth? How or how much do we value it if it doesn't attach to collective liberation? And so in structuring the book, I think the structure really reveals my literary critical proclivities, desires, and downright nerdiness, I suppose, my reveling in words and texts and narratives as so many puzzles to be explored, but really enjoyed in the process of exploration. So it is straightforward literary analysis broken down into a series of chapters, which I'll talk about, but it's also somewhat meandering because of the fact that it's vacillating between this attention to what's happening within the text and what this text is doing to us as readers, and very particularly as reader theorists. So in the introduction, I lay out the terrain of the book, of course, and what I really try to establish there is how community has been centered as the frame within which the Caribbean subject must operate, in contradistinction to the white Western subject. And I consider this phenomenon as something that cuts across gender lines and is embraced by a panoply of both male and female writers and intellectuals, particularly of the 20th century into the 21st century, right? So how Caribbean writers, be they in the Caribbean or in diaspora, be they male, be they female, be they situated in Europe, North America, Latin America, etc., how this tendency to adhere to the communal as central value is something that one might argue defines that broad literary tradition. And then taking Guadeloupean author, writer, thinker Maryse Condé's well-known essay, Order, Disorder, Freedom, and the West Indian Writer as sort of my organizing frame in this introduction, I go on to dig into the particular unsettledness that's produced by novels whose women characters are either excluded from or characters who expressly eschew models of political community that require self-sacrifice and solidarity at their expense. And so threaded throughout the introduction, certainly, and throughout the book more broadly, is the idea that there are circumstances wherein narcissistic self-regard, and there I revel in all the connotative affordances of that word, self-regard. There are circumstances wherein narcissistic self-regard can be an ethical choice, one that reveals to us the potential proximity of deviance and defense, and makes an unformulated yet radical claim, I think, for the necessity of transforming a given social order. And so each of the chapters of the book homes in on a particular work of literary fiction and a particular woman character who then tells her own story, who in the novel tells her own story, and then who I work to sort of take that story and think of it, as I said, both within the context of the narrative, but also with respect to broader histories, to our reading practices, particular to those histories, etc. So to give you a sense very quickly, for those of you who haven't had a chance to either read the book, read the introduction, etc., there are these 5 chapters, each of which is pretty pithily named and attached to a woman character and her, I guess you could say, iteration of self-regard. So start off with Tituba Indian, the central character of Maryse Condé's novel, I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem. And in thinking through Tituba, I attach her to the idea of self, which I'm sorry, losing my place here in the text. Moving back a little bit. I think about Tituba in the context of Puritanism, actually. Puritanism in its very literal sense, that is in the historical sense of North American history, but also the Puritanism, metaphorical Puritanism that continues to, in fact, or affect, I should say, I suppose, our ways of reading our history, our ways of reading women, and even more specifically, I'd say, with respect to the genre of the slave narrative and of the neo-slave narrative. And I'm thinking about Tituba and these concerns as regards the matter of purity, sexual purity in particular, and the sexual agency or interest of the enslaved, which is obviously a thorny topic. This has been questioned and queried with respect to this novel in the past, but what I try to do in the chapter is think about how in advocating, let's say, for Tituba's agency, she's often critically recovered to a narrative of Black feminism that may not necessarily be suited to who she really is or who Condé has crafted her to be in the novel. So the second section, which focuses on the titular character Adriana of René Depestre's Adriana in All My Dreams, and is paired with the connotation of self-regard that I've called self-possession. I think there about vaudou and the erotic, and about the Caribbean fetishization of whiteness. And there I look at the critical reception of this novel in particular, and the critical reception in the sense of reception that is critical and not just thinks critically of, but is critical of the novel as hyper-erotic or hyper-fetishistic of whiteness in ways that I think reveal our own anxieties about certain idiosyncrasies of the Caribbean around race and the erotic, specifically as those pertain to indigenous religious practices. This chapter also thinks about not only the sort of present-day theoretical critique of René Depestre's novel, but also the particular moment in Pan-African history where Depestre as an intellectual was taken to task by leaders of the Pan-African community, most notably Aimé Césaire, in ways that I think similarly reveal how progressive and liberatory communities can become spaces of coercion. Then in the third chapter, I pair a lesser known novel by Haitian writer Marie Chauvet, Fille d'Haïti, Daughter of Haiti, and the central character Lotus, with the question of self-defense. And there in that text, or in that chapter, I think about the tension between colorism and radicalism in Haiti, and specifically the extent to which sort of the politics of 20th century Haiti have turned in many ways around questions of color that attach to the Black female body or the brown female body or the, in quotes, mulatto female body. And so there, I think specifically about the conflicts between feminism and nation building, both again within the context of this critically rather ignored text, and also in the context of Chauvet's own life, a specific episode actually of her life wherein she made an appeal to Simone de Beauvoir, a successful appeal to Simone de Beauvoir as a Haitian woman, as a wife, as a woman of a certain class who was attempting to escape the strictures of her community through her writing. The fourth chapter, which I imagine Hazel's going to want to talk to you a bit more in detail because it concerns Jamaica Kincaid and her particularly, I mean, she's a controversial writer in general, but a particularly controversial novel of hers, the autobiography of my mother, and its central character, Zuela Claudette Richardson. And it thinks about the notion of self-preservation, both in, of course, a metaphorical sense, but also in a very literal sense, in as much as Zuela is a character who is descended from Dominica's indigenous population, right? So there, I think, and I have a grand old time in this chapter, thinking about the autobiography of my mother in conjunction, both with William Shakespeare's The Tempest and with Aimé Césaire's A Tempest. And I do this through the kind of the pivot point of Sylvia Wynter's essay, Miranda's Meanings. And so in this chapter, I think about Zuela's incredible anti-sociality as a safe space. I think of her as a vulnerable character who is in constant danger from the various constituents of her community. And then from there, I think about the critical reception of the novel as, in some ways, doing a disservice to the vulnerability of this character and not recognizing the extent to which her self-regard is very much a matter of life and death. And then in the final chapter, and I'll stop very, very shortly because I know we are not, we don't have a capacious amount of time. The final chapter focuses on a novel by Jamaican writer Marlon James, The Book of Night Women from 2009, and on its central character, Lilith, an enslaved woman on an 18th century Jamaican plantation. And there I return to these questions of the erotics of the enslaved, but also beyond the erotics, the romance that may or may not have been possible under the structure of total domination that was enslavement. And there I think specifically about a character, Lilith, who is really, there's no way around it, not nice and not that lovable in many ways, but yet who, as a deeply abused and victimized being, would seem to demand our sympathy. And so in this chapter, I think about the project of representing the trauma of Black history for consumption in the present, and what it means for James to have chosen a rather antipathic heroine to vehicle a story about the kinds of tensions that might have existed on an individual level within the context of enslavement. And so yes, on the whole, I would say that the women in the novels of my corpus are a troublesome set. And I realize that fraughtness, that troublesomeness, that difficulty and non-sympathetic nature of these characters was really what I wanted to critically cherish throughout this project. And so maybe I'll leave it there and let Hazel get started challenging, questioning, or what have you, the work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Glover. That was absolutely wonderful. And there are so many things that you've spoken about there or touched on that I'd love to ask you a bit more about. But before we dive into speaking about the book, I saw in your Twitter bio that you describe yourself as a disorderly woman. And I was wondering, what does being a disorderly woman mean to you? And what does it mean in terms of your relationship with the characters and the authors that you discuss in the book?
Oh, that is such a fun question. I really appreciate that. I can't believe you've gone to my Twitter as a place to start. I do appreciate it. So, well, first I'll say, so that is, again, it's kind of a cheeky wink in my Twitter bio to that shadow title of the book that I had thought to call Disorderly Women, because that was the way in which I was putting together my corpus. Who were the women characters that not only the order I had come to accept from the time of my graduate studies? What's the order, I'd say, against which the Caribbean writer is trying to establish her or himself, is trying to resist? And then how is that order disordered? But then in thinking, as I said, about how disorder needs to, or I think should be, a process of, as I think I say in the book at some point, unsettling all things endlessly. So to me, the danger of resistance or reaction or disordering of a particular order comprises with it the risk of sedimenting a new order. And so in saying that I'm trying to be a disorderly woman, I guess it's some sort of version of Fanon, let's say, closing of Black Skin, White Mask, make of me, oh my body, make of me a man who always questions, right? So this desire to put myself in a position of instability and query, always with respect to the texts that I work with and that I ask my students to think about. And then I'd say more broadly, with respect to my own politics and my own communal affiliations, hoping not to be too bound by the various communities to which I belong, insofar as at times those communities can certainly be at odds with one another. Yeah.
That's great. And that leads nicely to another thing I'm thinking about, which is there you kind of made sound being disorderly sound really like a great position to kind of occupy, whereas sort of in the book, the case, the sort of most compelling case is that we should learn to forgive and sort of tolerate self-interested, or as you said in your kind of introduction there, narcissistic behavior. Do you think that there are sort of, would you go so far as to kind of celebrate or encourage that kind of behavior, or is forgiveness enough in that kind of regard?
I'm going to try to nuance that a little bit, because part of what I was trying to do in the book, and part of what I was trying to say about my own disorder, well, okay, it's two separate things. My own disorder is being something that's aspirational, right? I don't think it's necessarily that easy, that desirable, or even that forgivable in some instances to be in a position of constant disorder, right? And in the book, I talk about the fact that disorder has at its origins this psychological understanding to it, right? It has a definition with the American Psychological Association, among others, as something that can be pathological, right? Something that can represent illness or neurosis, or a reaction that is a refusal to be contained by something that is causing violence to the person, but that hasn't necessarily arrived at some utopian solution either. And so when it comes to these characters, I suppose I'm not necessarily asking that they be forgiven. And I'm also very adamantly suggesting that they're not necessarily asking us to forgive them, that part of their charm for me, or their interest for me, is their disinterest. They're having arrived at a stage of being able to say, I just have to say no and let the chips fall where they may. But what I'm asking, I think, of the reader is not so much forgiveness as, one, taking them seriously and asking what we can understand via an investigation of the particular strands of their disorder. How are they disorderly? With respect to what are they wayward? With respect to what are they wild? And to what extent might we, if not forgive, at least recognize that their disorder was really a last recourse or a last option in the face of a community that might purport to have their best interests at heart, or that might endanger them in some way they find intolerable or unacceptable, if that nuance makes sense.
No, that's a great answer. Yeah, it really sort of pulling apart those sort of many meanings to the word disorder, which kind of flow through the book very nicely. And yeah, that leads me on. I was thinking, one of the things I really enjoyed about the book is the kind of focus on character that you take, and the kind of close attention to the ethics of the characters themselves. And I was wondering, yeah, and just the fact that the chapters are named after these 5 fictional women rather than their authors. And what really made you take this character-led approach in the sort of methodology of writing the book?
Yes, I mean, I think that's somewhat a function of my advanced age and my my sort of training in the idea of, you know, it's banal and we're all familiar with it, but that these books really have left the purview and the proprietariness of their authors, and belong to the world of fiction that they emerge into. And I think in these chapters, while I do certainly attend to some extent to the experiences of the authors, I am most interested in what they've offered us, the beings they've offered us, and why. And because they've given us these beings that for the most part speak in the first person, I really was excited to think of them, to give them the distinction of being able to speak for themselves, and really hoping to kind of coerce or guide my own reader into extracting themselves from, or setting to the side the biography of the authors, and joining me in this kind of community with these women. It may be fairly evident at this point, by the way I'm talking about them, that I do feel in some ways that I don't know if advocating is too strong a word, but I was in some measure of solidarity with each and every one of them. That doesn't mean I liked many of them or agreed with all of their choices by any means, but I appreciated what I saw as their challenge to me to accept those choices. And so, yeah, for that reason, I really wanted to foreground them from the very outset of the reader's encounter with the book.
And as you said, kind of one of the most difficult and challenging women that you discuss in the book is Suela, obviously, from my personal interests. I love that chapter so much. And in the last Caribbean Studies Network seminar, we had the historian Melanie Newton as our guest, speaking about indigeneity in the Lesser Antilles. And I got so excited when I saw that you'd made reference to her research in your chapter on Kincaid, and you described Suela's narrative as autoethnography, which it's just amazing. Could you tell us a bit more about those connections you were describing earlier about between Suela's self-preservation and preservation of Caribbean indigeneity?
Sure, thank you. Another wonderful question. So yes, there's so many layers to that. I think, yeah, where to begin? So obviously Melanie Newton, and I suppose many of the people who are on this Zoom were able to attend that lecture as well, so they have some, I hope, familiarity with her work. But what she has brought to the table very importantly and compellingly, I would say, is the importance of thinking through the, in many ways, reasonable claim of Afro-diasporic people to something akin to indigeneity when it comes to the Caribbean, but the ways in which those claims displace native populations of those same spaces. And Melanie Newton's work allowed me to think through Sylvia Wynter's own tendency to do that as well, right? So this was an immediate point of tension, but fascinating tension for me, the extent to which I rely so heavily as a Caribbeanist, as a woman, as a thinker, on Wynter's work to help me get out of the structural domination that is so prevalent in various aspects of my professional, literary, and other lives, but at the same time, how inherent in her project risks the existence of a certain other form of marginalization or inattention, let's say, to other populations. And so what I tried to do was to think through Wynter's idea of an indigenous woman, which she would posit as a Black or an Afro-diasporic woman, and to think of that woman as an actually indigenous woman, or more specifically, to imagine Kincaid as having offered us the possibility of thinking indigeneity beyond Blackness by so thoroughly crafting a character whose indigeneity whose indigenous heritage poses a problem for her, not with respect to a white colonial settler, but with respect to an Afro-diasporic community. And I just found that the adamance and the brilliance of Kincaid's work along those lines was insisting on the ways in which an Afro-diasporic community had made a scapegoat or a victim of one of its own members, and then showing the ways in which Suela's response to this extreme vulnerability was to develop this carapace of self-regard. And to argue, as Kincaid makes very plain throughout the novel, that this self-regard did have to take the form of self-preservation, right? There are literally people in Suela's world that have tried to kill her. But then, of course, if we're thinking indigeneity, we're thinking of preservation in a broader sense. We're thinking about the preservation of an ascendancy of an indigenous heritage that so many of us, Afro-diasporic scholars, have been perhaps a little too content to talk about as disappeared, eliminated, genocided, no longer present. So for Kincaid to bring that presence into the 20th century and to force us to contend with it, I found absolutely extraordinary. And then also, as you can see in the chapter, I delighted in her cheeky references both to the Shakespearean intertext around indigeneity and colonialism, and taking that to task in a beautiful and eloquent way, but also the way she has done, I feel she has done so with Césaire's writing back to that text. So again, showing us the ways in which there are layers of marginalization, and unless we keep ourselves in this position of querying endlessly, unsettling endlessly, we might get stuck in Césaire's 1969 play as the be-all and end-all of where this metaphor of relation between colonizer, colonized, and indigenous subject play out. So yeah.
That's great. And I suppose Kincaid writes Suela so that she's both Afro-Caribbean and indigenous, at the same time sort of complicating those things that we kind of see in binaristic ways in the Caribbean. And I was thinking, she's just one of 4 mixed race characters that you discussed in the book, 4 of these 5 main characters. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about what it is in particular about the mixed race female Caribbean body that is so disorderly and so disordering in the kind of in this kind of world of Caribbean literature.
Sure. Yeah, and I will just also say, so yes, so the all 4 of the 5 women are described in their narratives as being mixed race, and the 5th woman, who is Adriana, in the 2nd chapter, is a white Creole woman, but who, to my mind, fit into this this kind of concept of métissage or mixed raceness, in as much as one of the prominent dimensions of her character we learn is her cultural mixedness and for her feeling of affiliation with the Afro-diasporic population of her island where she was born, rather than with the white Frenchness of her parents. But to answer your question, racial disorder was inevitable to crafting this corpus and thinking about who unsettles the most and why. And I suppose, there are a number of ways in which I wanted to think about that. There are ways in which métissage, there's a whole stream of theorization around métissage and mixedness as romance, as opportunity, as possibility to think beyond the boundaries of white and black in the Caribbean, in ways that are meant to take away from the purist narratives that have allowed for enslavement and colonization in the first place, right? So métissage and mixedness as a creolizing offering from the Caribbean to the binaristic racial spaces that have been established through racial capitalism and imperialism. But what I wanted to think about, and yes, and I think that is very much the case. At the same time, I do think that there's a way in which mixed raced women in particular, as we can well imagine, are also suspect, and suspect in particular ways that I trace throughout this book, right? So suspect in their politics and in their allegiances, suspect in the question of their solidarity and identifications, their potential opportunism, and what I found cohering and interesting about the mixed race characters in these texts is that rather than either lean into the romance of métissage as resistance, and also rather than defend these mixed race women by making them identify explicitly with the politics of their Afro-diasporic communities, these are women who we are right to be suspect about, that actually do embody, very literally and of course figuratively, our anxieties, our legitimate anxieties in some ways about navigating color lines in various parts of the Americas, and makes us confront what it might look like, and to what degree we can understand, if not empathize, with poor political choices made by women who are aware of the advantages that might attend to their mixed race status, right? So I have loved looking at authors who compel us to delve into, as I said, those anxieties that we bring to mixed race bodies, and our hopes that these bodies will not disappoint us in their political allegiances, so to speak.
That's absolutely brilliant. Yeah. Please keep your questions coming into the chat box. I've just got one more question before I hand back over to Will for the Q&A part of the seminar. So, and that is that alongside your academic writing, as Will mentioned earlier, you're also a translator. And it was so interesting to see you reading Caribbean literature across languages, not just in your focus on these 3 Francophone writers and 2 Anglophone writers, but within the chapters themselves, you make fascinating connections between Aimé Césaire and Jamaica Kincaid, or Maryse Condé against Mary Prince. And could you just tell us a bit more about the interrelations you were able to find, or problems that you ran into whilst reading Caribbean literature across languages?
First of all, I'm just wondering if you could serve as the questioner for all book talks that I do going forward. Because I so appreciate the things that you're asking me and ways you're making me think about the book and reminding me in such an intellectually robust way of, you know, what I loved about doing the project. Right? This has been out for a few weeks, but it's been out of my hands for, you know, about a year. But coming back to it, I'm remembering now the process, and so I really appreciate your question, Hazel. To answer your question about language and translation. Well, first I'll just say that being a translator is such a, you know, it is an offering in some respects to a reading community, but it's also a very selfish pleasure in as much as I think, for me, the most intimate experiences I've had of reading texts has been in translating them. So there's one of the texts that here, Adriana, I did actually translate, but others of the authors, like Chauvet, I've translated another of her works. But the very process of kind of thinking more slowly about language that comes to me from translation certainly went into crafting this book. But the broader question about my corpus, I'm a francophonist, and I'm situated professionally within a French department, and yet I've gone rogue here and included the Anglophone community in the Anglophone literary tradition in my thinking. I'd say that's for 2 reasons. One is, you know, I would say a tendency to my frustration more broadly with the extent to which the linguistic balkanization of the Americas is such a stark reminder of our colonial legacies, right? The fact that the very fact of a French department, a Spanish department, an English department, et cetera, are iterations of a structuring of the world that has its roots in the transport, enslavement, and partitioning of Africans and African diasporic people into the Americas and beyond. And so, you know, I'd say that this was a second monograph affordance, right? And I'll be very blunt about that, the kind of post-tenure freedom that allows for me to speak to folks beyond the French context, to ask questions regionally, because in fact, while I'm situated within a French department, I'm affiliated robustly with an Africana Studies department. And so I tend to try at least to think across the boundaries and borders of nation languages in my own thinking, my own work. So that's a reflection of that freedom, that luxury, and that interest and commitment on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's aspirational. I do hope that the concept of self-regard that I attach to these particular texts and these particular island traditions might be something that we can think about into the wider Americas. You know, I think about the relationship between Caribbean studies and Black studies quite a lot, and I am concerned, I'd say, as many of us Caribbeans are, with the hegemony of Black studies and defining Blackness globally, and the ways in which even thinkers who are Caribbean, be it Edouard Glissant or Frantz Fanon or Sylvia Wynter, for that matter, Audre Lorde, etc., are sort of easily recuperated into US American Black studies in ways that elide their Caribbean specificity. And so I suppose I hope that in formulating a construct that I see as emerging from a Caribbean space, but applicable to a wider Afro-diasporic space, that can be a sort of pushback to that unidirectional tendency that has troubled me in the past.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. So I'm going to hand over to Will.
Thank you, Hazel.
Thank you so much, Hazel. That was wonderful. And as Hazel mentions, if you have questions, do just put them into the Q&A box, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. We've only got 10 minutes, so I'll plough straight on. We've got a question from Jacqueline Frost, who says that she's really looking forward to reading your book. So hasn't yet. So question is perhaps naive, she says. I'm sure it isn't. In fact, I've read it and it isn't. I'm compelled by how your book focuses on how your books focus on female individuality echoes Hegel's formulation, oft quoted in the heyday of feminist interpretations of canonical thinkers, that, quote, women are the everlasting irony of the community. The idea that women follow individual ends and derange the universal ends of family and state. I was curious if you would agree that women in particular occupy a deranging position with respect to the community. Why focus on women and not marginal subjects more generally in your work?
Hi, Jack. I'm so glad you're here. And thank you for that question. It's funny because the very first line of my book doesn't answer that, but posits it. You know, it says that this is a book about freedom. Its focus is on women for reasons that I go on to explain, but I think that many of its arguments aren't necessarily exclusive to women, in fact. And whereas Hazel just asked me a question about language and geocultural spaces, I think that the gender question could certainly be an extend forward from this work. But to answer you, why focus on women and not marginal subjects in general? I think it's a few reasons. I would say one, yes, I do agree that women can, not necessarily do, but can occupy a particular deranging position with respect to community. And this has a lot to do with gendered expectations that attach to women's performance in community, right? So that the prospect and the possibility for disordering, the slope is slipperier, let's say, between what is acceptable behavior and what is not. And that's simply because there are greater limitations on what counts as acceptable when it comes to people gendered as women. And then I think I would also say that as to the question of the Hegelian critique, or we could go to the Freudian critique of women's narcissistic pursuit of individual aims. What I am trying to do with the book is to not take up or refuse that misogynistic underpinnings of those critiques, but rather to lean into them and suggest that why do we hold dear to universal ends, be those the universal ends, as you say, of the family or of the nation, right? So I suppose, you know, it's an answer, non-answer, in as much as I don't mind accepting the premise of a particularly gendered dimension to disorder. And what I want to do is explore our response to that disorder and, if not celebrate it, at least use it as a heuristic from which to better understand the prevailing orders, be they in the narratives or in the literary traditions that within which these narratives are contained. I hope that answers to some extent your question.
Great, and if there are any follow-ups to that, do just stick them in the box. We've still got time, so do put questions in the box if you have them. Whilst you do that, I'm going to abuse my being on the camera and ask a question, if I may. I don't know if I'm a thought that came to mind when I was reading your book was about what's you talk about the second aspect being kind of how we read it, how it addresses us, and something that I was thinking about was the relationship between a gaze that's turned in on itself and a conception of the artwork that's turned in on itself. So the relationship between, say, self-regard and a kind of, not exactly aestheticist, but kind of something that's clearly taking great, a kind of textual, a kind of linguistic play that's clearly taking great pleasure in itself and in its own. And I was particularly taken by when you quote that very long, very beautiful passage of Kincaid's where she's talking about motherhood, and it becomes more and more baroque as she goes on, and there seems to be a great interesting kind of language play there, and in the kind of the sheer kind of ornamentation of language. So yeah, I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about sort of what this does to style, what this kind of these ideas of self-regard do to style in these books.
I love that question. I don't know that I'd thought about it that much or in that particular way, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you draw our attention to the Kincaid, the infamous passage where she talks about, in the wake of her abortion, Zuela talks about how this was not just the killing or the aborting of this child, but aborting the very idea of sharing herself and her body with a dependent being or any other being, in a way that, rather than just kind of state it and move on, is so indulgent in its refusal to be anything more than herself. And I think that's the word of the concept that adheres to this question of style, the indulgence. Every single one of these heroines or anti-heroines, each one of these novels features what, everything from the most superficial indulgence of an adamant relationship with the self, i.e. some scene of masturbation and self-love in the most physical way, or an indulgence in a self-description of the body as an object. And so one of the things that I think is fascinating and that comes out in these narratives, and obviously then is part of the stylistics of these narratives, is the self-objectification of each one of these characters in ways that can make us as readers, again, in as much as we've been trained not to objectify or want women to be objectified, yet we are confronted with these women who spend a fair amount of narrative time objectifying themselves, touching themselves, describing themselves, staring at themselves in mirrors. And what I think about is the way that these authors indulge or allow these women to indulge the self-reflective and self-objectification is itself, to me at least, some form of resistance to the gaze of their community. Yeah.
Great. We have a question. We've got 3 minutes, but we have a question from Renee. What do you feel is the silenced truth in Night Women? Is it that Lilith seeks safety where she can, and she is no more safe with the enslaved Jamaicans than the white characters? Her self-regard seems equal to other characters, but her mixedness, beauty, youth, father, and position in the home provide her with significant advantages which she harnesses successfully for survival.
Okay, I'll be rapid. The silenced truth, I don't know that it's actually that silence. I think it's there for the hearing, if we look, and are not put off too readily by the central character. But very quickly, I would just say that silenced truth is the vast complexity, diversity, and variety of the enslaved experience, period. And the extent to which Lilith is she is a particular being. She is a non-heroic being in a context wherein we have been sort of bred as readers and thinkers to expect heroism or to expect easy rooting for, let's say, the enslaved woman character, faced as she is inevitably with the structures of domination and violence and violation that she faces in the quotidian. And so the silence truth, I suppose, if we want to put it that way, about Night Women is this bold presentation of, as I said, that complexity, that misbehavior, that indecency at times that comes with Lilith's self-preservation, Lilith's self-regard, and her willingness to take advantage of whatever opportunity she has without saying, I need to hitch my wagon to the star of enslaved Black women's community, because there too, there is complexity, unreliability, and perhaps also danger to me as an individual. And so I think that's a bold move that James makes, especially as a male author writing a female enslaved person. And yes, and that to me is the reason why I wanted to close the book with this particularly extreme example, I think, of self-regard, where one might least expect it.
Wonderful. We are entirely out of time, I'm afraid. So just to say a very, very warm thank you again to Professor Glover. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear more about your work. Regarded Self was published last month by Duke University Press. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be hearing from Mimi Scheller, Professor Scheller at Drexel University, talking about her new book, Island Futures. So if any of you are around, do sign up for that. You can already register.
I'll see you there.
And other than that, have a great fortnight. Look after yourselves, and thanks again for joining us, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, Bill. Take care.